Forge, Chapter 43. We were at war in the weeks that followed, Bellingham and me, a stage play of war. He acted the part of a kind-hearted master, but was secretly armed with his ability to hurt Isabel. My role was the slow-witted, dutiful servant. Bellingham did not hire me out even for one day, so the inhabitants of Moor Hall became my weapons. As Bellingham had requested, I lavished extra attention and care upon Mr. Morris and Mr. Reed, always making sure that the best pieces of meat were set upon both their plates and that their glasses stayed full. I fashioned a stool for Mr. Morris to rest his sore ankle upon after he slipped on ice, and I sharpened Mr. Reed's quills, for he never took the time to do it himself. When Mr. Morris asked me to care for his boots, I won a skirmish. When I put all of his clothes to the rights, removing stubborn stains and unpleasant odors from his breeches, he expressed his gratitude with a coin and a compliment, and complimented Bellingham on his quality of his servant. That won me a minor battle and earned me duties of cleaning all of the gentlemen's clothing. Bellingham was clever enough not to trust my transformation back into obedience. He was shaved each day by Gideon and rarely allowed me in the same room with him if he was alone. My ears were my valued allies. When the plates and the glasses were filled, I was required to stand in the corner of the dining room and wait for the next order, or I'd fix my eyes upon the spot on the wall and stare as if I were a bit addled. In truth, I listened close to the conversating, waiting for information that would help us break free from this mountain. Much of what I had heard more meaning for soldiers shivering in their huts than for me. The causes of our starving times were many. The men in charge of supplying the army had not been prepared for winter encampment. The army did not have enough wagons to deliver food to camp, nor enough money to pay for it, and the local people had already sold their grain and meat to the British, forcing supplies to come from great distances. And to top it all off, there was no salt to be had, which made preserving meat and fish for the journey to camp near impossible. There were some 11,000 soldiers at camp, making Valley Forge the third biggest city in America, according to Mr. Folsom. To feed them proper required millions of pounds of bread and 1,000,000 pounds of meat every month. I had no notion of what 1,000,000 was, but I knew it was a vast sum. The gentlemen agreed that the fellows who had been running the office of the quartermaster and commissary should all be shot. During the next night, the rabbit pie was more of Mrs. Cook's turnips, which the gentlemen were fast tiring of. The talk centered on a battalion of black and Indian soldiers being assembled in Rhode Island, news that I could not wait to tell Isabel. The state was largely occupied by the British, and the Patriots could not find enough men to fill the ranks of their continental brigades. The Rhode Island Assembly had passed a law to free slaves if they served the entire war. They offered to pay their owners of the new soldiers 120 pounds for the loss of their property. This seemed to me such a sensible solution to so many problems. I could not figure why it had created discord or why the other states wouldn't allow or didn't follow suit. Mr. Morris then told of a recruitment plan he had heard that day, a notion put forth by John Lawrence, an aide de camp to General Washington. Lawrence claims that if the army does not double or triple in size, the war could drag on for years. He, too, wants to enlist and arm slaves who are willing to fight. He points to the general acceptance of hundreds of free Negroes here in camp as evidence that it would not cause any problems. "Ha!" snorted Mr. Dana. "What of their masters? How are they to be compensated?" "Young Mr. Lawrence has thought this through most carefully, said Mr. Morris. He says the government should compensate the slave owners a fair price for each man who goes into the army, just as they have done in Rhode Island. He thinks it might be a way to stop slaves from escaping and joining the British. A growing number seem determined to back whichever side grants them liberty. We have quite enough trouble with the British. To raise the issue of freedom for slaves right now would be setting a spark to gunpowder." Mr. Reed lifted his glass. "Cheers." I fought to keep my face plain and dull as the rest of the men returned to their toast. The more I pondered it, the angrier I became. I stole a glance at Gideon. Slaves, who were not friends, still could share a common sentiment about the injustices they suffered. Gideon stood as straight and stiff as a statue. His eyelids did not flicker as the congressman scorned the ideas of John Lawrence. He did not breathe. deeper or faster, or clench his fist to contain his anger. The gentleman could have been discussing the age of turnips on their plates and the chance of snow in the morrow. His reaction, or rather the absence of a reaction, made me more curious than ever of Gideon. I resolved to study his actions as carefully as I studied those of my captors.